Hi friends, write in the comments what city you are from. Perhaps you also had similar stories. It is very interesting to know what happened in your corner of the world. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like it, share your thoughts or stories in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. There are more exciting and unexpected stories ahead. All characters and events described in this story are fictitious. Any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. Do not judge strictly. The silence in Andrew's house wasn't just an absence of sound. It was thick, almost tangible, like a fog that settled on your shoulders and made it hard to breathe. It seeped into every room, every corner, every glance he and Sarah shared, or more accurately, didn't share over dinner. Andrew, 37, and a manager, looked older than his years. His thick dark hair was thinning at the temples, and there were shadows of chronic fatigue under his eyes. His shoulders were hunched, and his face was closed, a mask of indifference that hid a mixture of fatigue, guilt, and unexpressed irritation. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at a plate of cold rice and chicken, as if it might hold the answers to questions he had stopped even formulating. Across from him, Sarah, 34, was the picture of restraint. Her soft features had once radiated warmth and concern, but now her gaze was cold and distant, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away in a world where she could still dream. Her hair was neatly pulled back into a bun, highlighting the stern line of her jaw and the slenderness of her neck. She was silently chopping broccoli for their son, Lucas, without looking at Andrew. Her hand movements were precise and mechanical, like those of someone who had long been on autopilot. Lucas, an 8-year-old boy with serious eyes and a shock of unruly brown hair, picked at his food with his fork without looking up. He felt tense, didn't understand all the reasons, but he knew. The silence in the house was wrong. He became quieter, asked fewer questions, as if he was afraid of accidentally touching something fragile that might break. Their daughter, Mia, 14, sat next to them, scrolling through something on her phone under the table. Tall, with thin fingers and thick eyelashes, she wore the mask of indifference that teenagers so skillfully put on as a defense. But even through it, irritation and inner protest slipped through against pretense, against emptiness, against the eternal "everything is fine" that no one said out loud anymore. Sarah gave her a stern look. "Mia, no gadgets at the table," she said quietly, but there was no warmth or irritation in her voice, just mechanical habit, as if the phrase itself were the final ritual, tying this family together with a thin thread that was about to be cut by silence. Andrew nodded as if he were supporting her, but he was barely listening. He looked at her hands, the slender fingers, the short nails, the wedding ring she never took off. Once, those hands had reached out to him at night, entwined with his as they whispered about the future. Now they chopped vegetables, folded laundry, typed into her phone, all in silence, as if he were just a piece of furniture in their perfect suburban home. The house he'd bought by working until midnight so they could afford this street with neat lawns and neighbors who always smiled, even when they didn't want to. "How was your day?" he asked, more out of duty than interest. His voice was muffled, as if the words were drowned out by the silence. Sarah looked up, her gaze blank, as if she were looking right through him. "Fine," she replied with a shrug. Lucas had soccer, Mia had choir practice. Just a normal day. An ordinary day. Andrew hated that word. It was like a code, a cipher that hid everything they weren't talking about. He nodded, swallowing a piece of chicken without tasting it. Lucas, age 7, finally put down his fork and asked, "Can I have dessert?" Sarah sighed, but smiled the smile she saved for the children, but never for him. "Eat at least half the broccoli," she said. "But I already ate broccoli yesterday," Lucas said, pouting. "And eat today. It's good for you." Lucas rolled his eyes but complied. Mia, age 10, had already put her phone away, but now she simply stared out the window, as if there was something more interesting than this table, this family, this moment. Andrew looked away from his wife and turned his gaze to his daughter. "How did the rehearsal go?" he asked, trying to put concern into his voice. Mia shrugged without turning around. "It's fine," she said. The same code, the same empty word. "What were you rehearsing?" he persisted. Snowflake Round Dance. It's for the Christmas concert. She said the title without any enthusiasm. Miss Carter was screaming again. Everybody's screaming. Everybody's stupid. Mia, Sarah said sternly, don't swear. Mia leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest. I didn't use language. I just said it like it is. Andrew sighed. He looked at his plate, then back at his wife. You said you wanted to change the curtains in the living room. He would latch onto any topic. Sarah blinked, as if remembering what he was talking about. Yes, but then I decided there was no point. Why? He asked after a pause. Because we never have anyone visiting us anyway, she replied without looking up. Silence sat down at the table again, no longer as a guest, but as a permanent member of the family. Andrew felt the silence thicken, enveloping them all like a cocoon. He tried to remember when it had become like this. Maybe it was when Lucas had started first grade and Sarah had started spending more time outside the house yoga, hanging out with friends, some class she'd mentioned. Maybe it was when he himself had started staying late at work because it had become increasingly difficult to come home. Or maybe it had started even earlier, on those nights when they stopped making love, when their bed had become just a place to sleep, if you could even call those hours of him lying staring at the ceiling and her facing the wall asleep. Tired? Sarah asked, her voice pulling him out of his thoughts like a gentle touch he had long since grown unaccustomed to. He blinked, not immediately realizing that she was talking to him. Yes, he said, although it was only part of the truth. Fatigue was a convenient excuse, a shield behind which he hid everything else. Fatigue from work, from endless reports, from calls with clients who always wanted more than he could give. Fatigue from the children who seemed to be growing up too fast for him to keep up with them. Fatigue from this house where everything was perfect, the floors were clean, the cushions neatly arranged, the closets sorted by color, but nothing was alive. Neither in the things nor in the words. Nothing in them. And you? He asked after a pause, with little hope of hearing anything honest. She shrugged, that gesture again, that gesture that was too silent. He had come to hate that shrug as a symbol of her distance, her inner, I don't know and I don't want to say. Also, she said, and stood up, collecting the plates. Her voice was even, without reproach, without intonation, as if it were a secretary's answer to a phone call and not a wife's answer to her husband's question. I'll clean up, go work if you need to. He watched her take his plate, carefully, not brushing it with her fingers. Once there had been movement between them, easy, warm, sincere, but now only function remained. She was the mistress of the house, he the breadwinner. Everything else seemed to have faded, erased. I don't have to work, he said quietly, almost hesitantly. Not today. Sarah put the dishes in the sink and turned on the water, but didn't turn around. She stood there for a few seconds, staring at the stream, as if there was something there that she couldn't find in herself. Then rest, she said finally. You look tired. You already said so, he chuckled weakly, but thank you. She nodded, but still didn't look at him. Behind her, Mia stood up without saying a word and went into her room. Lucas, finishing his broccoli, asked quietly, Will Dad work at night again? Andrew wanted to answer right away, but Sarah beat him to it. No, Dad is resting today. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but directed at her son. Never at him. He stood up from the table, moving closer to Sarah than he had in weeks. Maybe we can just talk for a bit while the kids are busy, he said carefully. Sarah turned off the water, dried her hands on a towel, and turned slowly. There was no hostility in her face, but no desire either. About what? She asked, simply as if asking if he wanted tea. He fell silent. The answer was somewhere inside, but all that layer of fatigue, unsaid things, and days when they were silent more than they spoke lay between him and the words. I don't know, he finally said. About us, I guess. Sarah looked at him for a long time, then lowered her eyes. I'm not sure we have a we, she said with quiet weariness. But if you want, we can try. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't a reproach. It was the last, fragile remnant of honesty and, perhaps, a chance. He didn't want to work. He wanted her to sit next to him, to talk like they used to look at him the way she had when they were first married. But he simply nodded and walked into the living room, where his laptop sat on the coffee table, another silent reproach. Andrew opened his laptop, but instead of working, he launched his browser and went to X. He didn't know why. It was just a habit to scroll through his feed when his thoughts got too loud. Posts flashed before his eyes. Someone complaining about traffic in Raleigh, someone bragging about a new cocktail at a bar, someone sharing a photo of a sunset. He stopped at a post from a local blogger who was writing about a new cafe downtown. The photo was bright, with warm lamplight and a cup of coffee in the foreground. But standing in the corner of the frame, almost unnoticeable, was Sarah. He froze. There she was, wearing the same blue scarf he'd given her for their anniversary, the same chestnut brown hair pulled back into a low bun. She was standing at the counter, smiling, not at the camera, but at someone nearby. The man, tall and with a dark beard, was leaning toward her, their shoulders almost touching. Andrew zoomed in on the photo, his heart pounding. The date of the post was yesterday. Yesterday, when Sarah had said she'd be late for yoga. He felt his throat tighten, as if someone had tightened an invisible noose. This doesn't mean anything, he said out loud to himself, but his voice was shaking. He opened her Instagram, knowing it was stupid, that he shouldn't do this. Her profile was the same as always. A few posts about her kids, about the flowers in her garden, about the books she was reading. But her stories were where she was real. He scrolled through them, one by one. Morning coffee, the drive, the yoga studio. And then there was the cafe again. The same scarf. The same man glimpsed in the reflection of the store window. She hadn't signed him, hadn't tagged him, but he was there, like a shadow Andrew couldn't help but see now. He put the phone down, feeling something inside him break. It wasn't just a photo. It was a crack that was starting to spread across everything he thought of as his life. Andrew stood up, stretched, his joints creaking. 37 years old, and his body was already sending signals that his youth was somewhere behind him. He went to the sink, poured a glass of water, and took a sip. The cold was chilling, but not refreshing. He looked out the window at the dark backyard, where the swing swayed gently in the evening breeze. Everything was so right, too right, like a real estate listing, where everything was in its place, but there was no soul. The next day, Andrew woke up with a heavy head, as if he had spent the night arguing with himself. Sarah was already gone, meeting a friend, she had said in the morning, kissing the children goodbye. She had left a note on the refrigerator, "Back for dinner. Kiss the kids for me." Her handwriting was neat, but Andrew looked at the words as if they were someone else's. He drove the kids to school, trying to appear normal. Mia chatted about her biology project. Lucas was silent, staring at a game on his phone. Andrew smiled, joked, but his mind was elsewhere. In that cafe. In that smile he didn't see at home. At work, he couldn't concentrate. His coworker, Matt, noticed it over coffee. "Are you okay?" Matt asked, taking a sip from his mug. "Yeah, I just didn't get enough sleep," Andrew lied, looking into his coffee. "Sarah," Matt always had a knack for guessing. Andrew shrugged. I don't know. Tired, I guess." Matt nodded without pressing. "It happens. Maybe you two need some time alone." Andrew chuckled. Alone time. When was the last time they'd been alone? He couldn't remember. When he got home, he opened Sarah's laptop. The password was Mia's birthday. Browser, Instagram, direct. Messages with friends, nothing special. But one name stood out, Jake. Short messages, nothing explicit, but enough to make Andrew's heart clench. "See you at the cafe," was the last message sent yesterday. He closed his laptop, feeling the world around him crumble. The silence in the house grew louder, and now it was screaming the truth he didn't want to hear. The silence in Andrew and Sarah's house was no longer just a backdrop, but a full-fledged character in their lives, silent but powerful, dictating its own rules. It was everywhere, in the creaking parquet that no one noticed, in the cold light of the lamps, in the way he and Sarah avoided looking each other in the eye. After dinner, as silent as it had been for months, Andrew was alone in the living room. The children, Mia and Lucas, were already upstairs, lost in their own worlds, tablets, books, dreams. Sarah went into the bedroom, muttering something about being tired, although her shadowed eyes spoke of something more. Andrew did not stop her. He had become accustomed to her leaving not just the room, but their shared space, what had once been their marriage. He sat on the sofa, old but comfortable, the one they had chosen together in the early years, when everything had still seemed possible. His fingers played unconsciously with the edge of the cushion as his gaze swept around the room. The shelves filled with books they no longer read, the framed photographs of children smiling against autumn leaves or a sunset on the beach, and one photograph, almost forgotten, tucked behind others, in the corner of a shelf where dust had settled in a thin layer. Andrew stood up, his heart tightening with some inexplicable premonition, and picked it up. There was Sarah in the picture. Not the Sarah who chopped broccoli at dinner or left notes on the refrigerator, but a different Sarah, young and vibrant and alive. She was standing in the center of the frame at a party, wearing a short black dress that hugged her like a second skin. Her hair, even longer then, fell in waves around her shoulders, and there was a fire in her eyes, not the subdued light he saw now, but a real wildfire, as if she could set the world on fire with a smile. She was holding a glass of something sparkling, laughing, her head thrown back, and around her was a whirlwind of light, music, people. Andrew remembered that night, their third year together, a party at a friend's house in downtown Raleigh, when they could still dance until dawn, drink cheap wine, and make out in the cab on the way home. He ran his finger along the glass of the frame, as if he could touch that Sarah, that life. In the photo, they were standing on the shore of a lake, bathed in the golden light of sunset, both young, a little awkward, not yet learned to wear adult masks. He held her by the waist, she laughed, her head thrown back, and her hair fluttered in the wind. They were different then. He was different, a 30-year-old guy just starting a career in it, full of ideas and ambitions, ready to move mountains. She was his muse, his challenge, the woman who made him feel alive, free, needed. He remembered how she could look at him long, attentively, as if listening to his silence. How she would put her palm on his chest and say, "Your heart beats like a boy's. You haven't realized yet that everything is possible." It seemed like magic then. He believed her. They spent their evenings together. Pizza on the floor of their new apartment, movies on their laptop, talking until 2 in the morning about nothing and everything. They would go to a neighboring city for the weekend just because they wanted to be on the move together. She made Spotify playlists that she called For Us, and he secretly learned to cook so he could surprise her at least once. Sex wasn't just about the body, it was an extension of a conversation that involved every cell. They weren't just touching each other, they were exploring, tuning in, searching for a rhythm. He remembered how she laughed when he accidentally dropped a pillow, and how she reached for him later, running her foot over his thigh, teasing, sincerely, without studying eroticism. He remembered how her breathing became intermittent in the dark, how she whispered his name, then still with desire, not with fatigue. He was in love with Sarah, not with an idea, not with an image, but with the living Sarah, stubborn, emotional, with shining eyes and eternally cold fingers with which she touched his face, as if checking whether he was really there. Now he looked at that photograph and saw a ghost, not just of her, but of himself. Andrew, who knew how to hold her hand without thinking about the last time he had done so. The one who wanted to, not just had to. He heard light steps behind him. Sarah was walking into the kitchen, barefoot, in a dressing gown. And at that moment he realized, either he would continue to live in these memories, or he would try to make at least one new one, maybe not ideal, but real. Andrew put the frame back, but something inside him was bothering him. He pulled out his phone and opened her Instagram, scrolling through her stories again, just like he had yesterday, when he first noticed the man in the cafe. She had posted a new one today, a mirror selfie in a yoga studio, her face calm, but her eyes with a shadow of the same sparkle that had been in the old photo. He zoomed in, peering into the background. There he was again, in the corner, a flash of him, a bearded man in a dark jacket, standing at the studio's exit. This was no accident. Andrew felt the blood pound in his temples, and his fingers gripped the phone so tightly that the screen flickered. He came upstairs, his steps heavy, as if his legs were filled with lead. Sarah was sitting cross-legged on the bed, her laptop in her lap. She looked up, and for a second he thought she flinched, as if she knew he was about to ask her something she didn't want to hear. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, almost hoarse. He held up the photograph he'd brought from the living room. "Look." She frowned, put down her laptop, and picked up the frame. Her fingers lingered on the glass, and Andrew saw her lips twitch, half a smile, half a grimace. "Oh my God, that was 100 years ago," she said. Her voice was light, almost playful, but there was a tension in it, like a string about to snap. "Where did you find that?" "On the shelf," he answered, sitting on the edge of the bed. He looked at her, trying to find the girl in the photograph, but saw only the woman who had become almost a stranger to him. "Do you miss us?" The question hung in the air, heavy as a thundercloud, filled with words that did not dare to spill. Sarah froze. Her fingers tightened around the frame, her knuckles white. She looked at the photograph, but her gaze was somewhere far away to that night, to that life where she was different. Free, sexy, alive. Where she reached out to him not out of habit, but out of desire. Andrew waited. Silence filled the room again, but now it was different, not just empty, but filled with everything that had been accumulating for years, unsaid, postponed, pushed for later. "We're parents now, Andrew," she said finally. Her voice was quiet but firm, as if she told herself this 1,000 times. "This is life. Kids, a house, a job. This is what we chose." He nodded slowly, but there was no agreement on his lips and no peace in his eyes. "This is what we chose," he repeated. "But are you happy? I mean, really?" Sarah looked away. Her fingers were now fiddling with the edge of the blanket, as if searching for support. For a moment she was afraid not of the question, but of the possible answer. "I don't know what you want to hear," she said, and there was finally a crack in her voice, not anger, not irritation, but something more fragile, as if she were afraid of her own words. "We're doing what we have to do. For Mia, for Lucas. Isn't that enough?" "When was the last time you laughed at something other than them?" he asked. "When was the last time you touched me because you wanted to, and not because you needed a goodnight hug?" Sarah closed her eyes, as if the words had hit her hard. "Do you want me to say that I am unhappy, that I miss you, that sometimes, when I lie next to you, I think about how we got lost?" Her voice turned into a whisper. "Yes, I want to. Sometimes I remember how you looked at me, how we fell asleep holding each other, how we wanted each other simply because we couldn't do anything about it. But now everything is different." He extended his hand carefully, as if he was afraid of scaring her. "I don't need memories. I need something real, even if it's just a conversation, even if you tell me that you're hurt or scared. But tell me, be with me at least in this." Sarah slowly placed the photograph on the nightstand and looked at him. Her eyes held everything: tiredness, hurt, tenderness, confusion, and maybe a drop of hope. "I'm not sure I can talk to you like I used to," she whispered, "but maybe we can still learn if you really want to." He nodded, and this time there was no pretense in his nod, but choice. Andrew felt something inside him tighten. He wanted to scream that no, that wasn't enough, that he wanted her back, not the mother of his children, not the woman who left notes on the refrigerator, but the Sarah who laughed at parties, who kissed him like there was no tomorrow. But instead he just nodded, because telling the truth was too scary. "I saw you," he blurted out, and he immediately regretted it. Her eyes widened, just for a moment, but it was enough for him to know she knew what he meant. "What?" Her voice became quieter, almost a whisper. "At the cafe. In the photo at X. You were with someone." He didn't mean for it to sound like an accusation, but the words came out hard, sharp. "Who is he?" Sarah swallowed, her face going pale, but she quickly composed herself. It's just a friend, a yoga colleague. We were just stopping by for coffee, Andrew. It's nothing. He looked at her, trying to believe, but her eyes avoided him, and the evasiveness was louder than any words. You didn't tell me you were there, he said, his voice shaking, betraying the pain he was trying to hide. I don't have to account for every step I take, she replied, and now there was steel in her voice. You don't tell me where you go, who you talk to either. It's called trust, Andrew. Trust. The word hit him like a slap. He wanted to tell her that he trusted her, that he still trusted her. But the image of the man in the cafe, her smile, her laughter, all of it stood between them like a wall. He stood up, feeling the room growing too small, too stuffy. I just want us to be honest, he said, his voice almost pleading. If something's wrong, tell me. Sarah was silent, her gaze fixed on the photograph she still held. It's okay, she finally said, but her words sounded empty, like an echo in an empty house. Andrew left the bedroom, his heart pounding in his chest. He went downstairs to the living room, where his phone was still lying. He opened the X, found the post again, zoomed in again. Sarah and the man. Their shoulders were almost touching, her smile too alive, too real. He scrolled through her stories, finding more clues: cafes, yoga, reflections that glimpsed a familiar figure. This wasn't just a coincidence. This was another life she'd been living while he'd been eating dinner, while he'd been working, while he'd been trying to be a good father and husband. He sat down on the couch, feeling the world crumble around him. The silence in the house had become unbearable, and now it was screaming a truth he didn't want to hear. Sarah was somewhere else, not just in body, but in spirit, and he didn't know how to bring her back. The next morning began as usual. Sarah left early, leaving a note in the kitchen: drop kids, then yoga. Be back for lunch. Her handwriting was neat, familiar, but Andrew looked at the words as if they were hiding something more. He drove the kids to school, trying to appear normal, answering Mia's chatter about her school project and nodding at Lucas, who was silent, his nose glued to his phone. But his mind was elsewhere, on that photo from the cafe, on Sarah's smile he hadn't seen at home, on the man whose face now haunted him. Back home, Andrew sat at the kitchen island, opened his laptop, but his work was slow. His gaze fell on Sarah's phone, lying on the counter. She'd forgotten it, a rarity for her, given how she always kept it with her, as if it were a part of her. Andrew stared at the black screen, feeling a war between leaving it alone or picking up the phone and checking. He knew it was wrong, an invasion of her privacy, but the image of her in the cafe, her evasive answers, her distance, pushed him forward. He picked up his phone, his heart pounding. The password was the same: Mia's birthday. The screen lit up, and immediately an Instagram notification popped up. At @velvetmuse_x mentioned you in a story. Andrew froze. It wasn't her usual name, not the @Saraj_Mills he knew. He opened Instagram, but the @Saraj_Mills account was the same as always. A few posts about babies, flowers, books, nothing out of the ordinary. But the notification didn't go away, and the name @velvetmuse_x burned in his mind like a warning. He typed the name into the search bar. The profile was private, but the avatar, a black and white photo of a woman's silhouette in dim light, made his stomach clench. He recognized those lines, that posture. This was Sarah, but not the one who cooked dinner or left notes, the one who lived in his memories, in that photo from the party where she was bright, free, sexy. Andrew felt the blood rush to his temples. He went back to her main account, checked her following at @velvetmuse_x was not there. But the notification was still there, proof that he hadn't made this up. He knew he was crossing a line, but he couldn't stop. He logged out of her main account and tried at @velvetmuse_x using the same password. It didn't work. He tried their anniversary, nothing. Then he entered Lucas's birthday, and the screen flashed he was in. The @velvetmuse_x profile was like a door into another world. No kids, no family photos, no hint of their suburban life. Instead, pictures that took Andrew's breath away. Sarah in black lace lingerie, standing in front of a mirror, the light hitting her skin so it almost glowed. Sarah in a silk shirt, unbuttoned just enough to suggest, but not show. Sarah against a sunset in a low-cut dress, her lips slightly parted, her gaze a challenge. The captions were short but sharp. Live in the moment. Secrets are what keep us alive. Who said the night is only for sleeping? Andrew scrolled through them, feeling something inside him crumble. This wasn't just another side of Sarah. This was another life she'd led while he sat at dinner, while he worked, while he tried to be a good husband and father. There was more in the stories, a video of her dancing in the dim light, her movements slow, almost hypnotic, a photo of her with a glass of wine, her fingers brushing the edge of the glass as if it were alive. And again, the man not in the foreground, but in the reflections, in the corners of the frame, like a shadow following her. One post in particular struck a chord. Sarah in that same cafe, her hand on the table, another hand next to hers, a man's with a dark bracelet on his wrist. The caption, "Sometimes a chance meeting is fate." He put his phone down, his hands shaking. This wasn't just cheating, this was an entire universe created without him. He felt like a stranger in his own life, like he'd been written out of a script he considered his own. He wanted to barge in, to scream, to demand answers, but she was at yoga or somewhere else in the world where at velvetmuse_x existed. Andrew stood up, pacing the kitchen, trying to collect his thoughts. He poured himself a cup of coffee, but the cup remained untouched. The taste was as bitter as his thoughts. He returned to his phone and opened the profile again. The comments under the posts were full of admiration. "You are a goddess. Where do you get so much fire? Who is this lucky guy?" The last comment was from the account at Nightwanderer. Andrew clicked on it. The profile was almost empty, a few blurry photos, dark landscapes, nothing specific. But in one of the stories, he saw a familiar silhouette, a man with a beard in a dark jacket, the same one who was in the cafe. Andrew felt his heart skip a beat. He scrolled further. Another photo. Sarah in the car, wearing the red lipstick she never wore at home. The caption, "Freedom is a choice." Andrew closed his eyes, trying to remember the last time he'd seen her with lipstick like that. He couldn't. At home, she was different in gray sweatshirts, with tired eyes, with the mask of a mother and a wife. But here, in this profile, she was alive, vibrant, the Sarah he'd once loved but lost. He heard the front door open. Sarah was back sooner than he expected. Her footsteps were light, almost silent, but he felt them like a jolt, like a tremor running through the house, from the walls to the bones. He didn't move. He just tightened his grip on his phone, still unlocked, the screen glowing faintly, like forbidden headlights in the fog. Sarah walked into the kitchen, her hair damp with sweat, her yoga mat slung casually over her shoulder. She smelled of the outside air, mint, something fresh and out of place. She stopped, saw him, and glanced at her phone in his hand. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but her face remained calm. "Andrew?" Her voice was even, almost neutral, but he caught a subtle concern in it. As if something in the room had changed, something he could not reach, but could feel on his skin. "Are you all right?" He swallowed, feeling the words catch in his throat. He wanted to say it all, lay the truth out like cards on the table. At velvetmuse_x, the photos, the captions, the man in the cafe with her hand on his elbow. But something stopped him. The fear that all of this really will turn out to be true. The fear of hearing an answer after which there will be nothing left. Or hope, however weak, that he made it all up. That it was a mistake, a coincidence, an accident. He slowly placed the phone on the table, screen down, as if he wanted to bury all his fear under it. He forced himself to smile, briefly, tensely. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said. His voice sounded fake even to himself. "Just thinking." Sarah nodded, but her gaze lingered on the phone a little longer than was natural. A second, maybe two, enough for him to notice. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, and went upstairs without looking back. He was left alone, in a silence that suddenly became ringing, not like a pause, but like a sentence. Andrew looked at the phone lying on the table. The black screen reflected his face, pale, tense. He didn't recognize himself. He didn't recognize a lot, and he didn't know how to destroy this invisible but strong wall that silence had built between them. He stood up and went to the window. Outside the glass, the evening was slowly approaching the street. The houses were turning off the lights one by one. The world was getting ready for sleep. And inside him, everything was just beginning. If not say now, then when? And if she is no longer the one I loved, then who is she now? He looked at the phone again, and suddenly he realized silence can kill no worse than betrayal, and maybe tomorrow will be too late. He heard the front door open. Sarah was back sooner than he expected. Her footsteps were light, almost silent, but he felt them like a jolt, like a tremor running through the house, from the walls to the bones. He didn't move. He just tightened his grip on his phone, still unlocked, the screen glowing faintly, like forbidden headlights in the fog. Sarah walked into the kitchen, her hair damp with sweat, her yoga mat slung casually over her shoulder. She smelled of the outside air, mint, something fresh and out of place. She stopped, saw him, and glanced at her phone in his hand. Her eyebrows lifted slightly, but her face remained calm. Andrew, her voice was even almost neutral, but he caught a subtle wariness in it, as if something in the room had changed, something he couldn't touch but could feel on his skin. "Are you okay?" He swallowed, feeling the words catch in his throat. He wanted to say it all, lay the truth out like cards on the table. At @velvetmuse_X, the photos, the captions, the man in the cafe with her hand on his elbow. But something stopped him. The fear that all of this really will turn out to be true. The fear of hearing an answer after which there will be nothing left. Or hope, however weak, that he made it all up. That it was a mistake, a coincidence, an accident. He slowly placed the phone on the table, screen down, as if he wanted to bury all his fear under it. He forced himself to smile, briefly, tensely. "Yeah, I'm fine," he said. His voice sounded fake even to himself. "Just thinking." Sarah nodded, but her gaze lingered on the phone a little longer than was natural. A second, maybe two, enough for him to notice. "I'm going to take a shower," she said, and went upstairs without looking back. He was left alone, in a silence that suddenly became ringing, not like a pause, but like a sentence. Andrew looked at the phone lying on the table. The black screen reflected his face, pale, tense. He didn't recognize himself. He didn't recognize a lot, and he didn't know how to destroy this invisible but strong wall that silence had built between them. He stood up and went to the window. Outside the glass, the evening was slowly approaching the street. The houses were turning off the lights one by one. The world was getting ready for sleep. And inside him, everything was just beginning. If not say now, then when? And if she is no longer the one I loved, then who is she now? He looked at the phone again, and suddenly he realized silence can kill no worse than betrayal, and maybe tomorrow will be too late. Andrew sat down, his head in his hands. He hadn't said anything to her, but the truth was already living inside him like poison, slowly poisoning everything he thought of as his life. He knew he couldn't stay silent for long, but for now he just sat there, listening to the silence in the house screaming at him about what he had lost. Andrew sat in his office, a small room on the second floor where he usually went through work reports or tried to focus on something other than the emptiness that had settled into their home. The silence was different here, not as oppressive as the living room or the kitchen, where he and Sarah avoided each other, but still heavy, as if the walls had absorbed their silence. The light from the desk lamp fell on his laptop, but the screen was dark, it wasn't working, couldn't. Thoughts of Sarah, of her second account, at @velvetmuse_X, which he'd discovered yesterday, burned inside him like a slow burning ember. He hadn't told her he knew. He hadn't shown her that he'd seen her other life, the one where she wasn't a wife or a mother, but someone else entirely. But knowing that had changed everything. Every look she gave him, every word she said, now seemed like part of the mask she wore at home. It was past midnight. The kids, Mia and Lucas, were asleep in their rooms, their doors closed, their lights out. Sarah had gone to bed an hour ago, leaving him with a quick, "good night," that sounded like a formality. Her phone was in the kitchen. She never forgot it again, but Andrew didn't want to pick it up again. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his fingers shaking with a mixture of fear and curiosity. He knew he shouldn't, but he opened Instagram anyway and typed in at velvetnews_x. The profile loaded instantly, and the avatar a black and white silhouette of a woman whose curves he'd recognize out of 1,000 stared back at him like a riddle he couldn't solve. Andrew clicked on the profile, expecting to see the same private account he'd found on her phone. But now he looked at it from a different perspective, not as a thief who'd stolen a password, but as one of thousands of followers. And there were thousands. More than 15,000 to be exact. The number seemed absurd, like a bug in a program he couldn't debug. He refreshed the page, thinking it was a glitch, but the numbers only grew. The posts were getting thousands of likes, hundreds of comments, and donation notifications were flashing in her stories. Someone was transferring money, someone was offering exclusive content, someone was writing explicit messages that made Andrew's jaw ache. This wasn't just Sarah's secret. It was an entire empire she'd built behind his back. He scrolled through his feed, each post a slap in the face. Sarah in a scarlet lace bodysuit, standing by a window with the lights of the city flickering outside, her skin glowing in the dim light. Sarah in a black satin shirt, casually unbuttoned, her gaze at the camera daring, almost mocking. Sarah on the roof of some building, in a dress that clung to her like a second skin, with the caption, "The night belongs to those who aren't afraid to take it." The comments under the photos were a chorus of alien voices. "You're fire. When's the next post?" "Ready to meet Earl," one user wrote. "Name a price for a private and I'm yours." Andrew felt his fingers squeeze the phone so hard the screen flickered. He clicked on her stories, and it only got worse. Short clips of Sarah moving like she was dancing, her hair flowing over her shoulders, her lips glistening with a lipstick he'd never seen at home. In one, she was sitting on the edge of a bed, not their bed, with its usual cotton sheets, but a different one, with dark silk and dim candlelight. She leaned toward the camera, her voice low and husky, almost intimate. "I'm your dirty fantasy." Andrew froze, his breath catching in his throat. She wasn't saying this to the throng of followers, not to these thousands of strangers who liked her posts and sent her money. She was saying this to him, or so he thought. Her words cut into him like shards of glass, because this was Sarah, but not the Sarah he knew. Not the one who cut vegetables for dinner, not the one who kissed the children before school, not the one who slept next to him with her back to the wall. This was the woman who lived on the screen, in a world where he was superfluous. Andrew scrolled on, unable to stop. Another video, Sarah in the same cafe where he'd first seen her in someone else's photo in X. She was sitting at a table, her fingers playing with a martini glass, and in the reflection of the glass he caught a glimpse of him, the man with the beard and the dark jacket, the one whose presence had haunted Andrew. His face was blurry, but the caption underneath the video was clear. "One moment can change everything." Andrew felt his heart clench. This was no chance encounter. This was the life Sarah had led while he was at work, while he was struggling with reports, while he was trying to be the person he thought she wanted him to be. He went into at Velvet Muse X's DMs, even though he knew it was a mistake. The messages poured in by the dozens from men, from women, from people whose names were just strings of letters and numbers. Some wrote, "You're an inspiration, keep shining." Others were more candid. "How much for a private chat?" "Ready to meet up in Raleigh." One account, at Night Wanderer, stood out from the rest. Its messages were short but personal. "You know how to turn me on. I'll see you tomorrow." Andrew clicked on the profile, but it was almost empty dark photos, blurry silhouettes, nothing that would answer the question. But in one of the stories, he saw him the same man, in the same jacket, with the same beard, standing outside some bar. Andrew felt his world shrink to a dot. He returned to Sarah's profile, scrolling further. Another photo, Sarah in a car, her lips painted a scarlet shade she never wore at home. She looked at the camera, her gaze hard, almost defiant. "You know what you want. Take it." The caption, "Freedom is a choice." Andrew closed his eyes, trying to remember the last time he'd seen her like this, alive, bold, full of fire. He couldn't. At home, she was different, in shapeless sweatshirts, with tired eyes, with a voice that uttered only the necessary words. But here, at @velvetmuse_X, she was a star, a woman adored by thousands, who collected likes and donations, who whispered words into the camera that broke his heart. Andrew stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark suburb. The street lamps cast a dim glow on the neat lawns, but even they seemed alien now, like stage sets for a life he no longer understood. He poured himself a scotch from the bottle he kept in his desk drawer, but even the sip brought no relief. The taste was as sharp as his thoughts. He went back to his phone, opened the profile again. Another video. Sarah on the beach in a bikini, her skin glistening in the sun, the wind playing with her hair. The caption, "Live like there's no tomorrow." The comments, "You're a dream. When are you coming to Miami?" Andrew felt his reality crumbling. He watched Sarah become someone else, not the one who had been with him, the mother of his children, the wife who left notes on the refrigerator, but the one who lived in this virtual world where she was free, desirable, unattainable. He heard the floorboards creak. Sarah came downstairs, her bare feet barely touching the floor. She was wearing a long t-shirt, her hair loose, her eyes sleepy. She looked at him standing by the window, phone in hand, and frowned. "Andrew, are you still working?" Her voice was soft, but there was a hint of irritation in it. "It's late." He swallowed, feeling the words escaping him. He wanted to scream about @velvetmuse_X, about her video, about how she had whispered, "I am your dirty fantasy," to thousands of strangers, but he couldn't. The fear that the truth would tear apart their family, their home, their lives paralyzed him. He set the phone face down on the table and forced himself to smile, though it was a tight, mask-like smile. "Yeah, just checking my email," he lied, his voice sounding alien. "I'll be going to bed soon." Sarah nodded, her gaze flickering to her phone, but she said nothing. "Don't stay up too long," she said, turning toward the stairs. Her footsteps faded away at the top, and Andrew was left alone in the silence that was now saturated with her second life. He looked at his phone, where the @velvetmuse_X profile still burned in his memory. He didn't know how to live with this, how to look at her, how to be with a woman who belonged not only to him, but to a world he'd never known. Andrew didn't sleep. The night dragged on, as if time had decided to freeze him in this nightmare, where he scrolled through @velvetmuse_X's profile over and over until his phone screen burned his fingers. Every post, every video, every comment from strangers who admired Sarah was like salt in an open wound. He sat in the living room, in the darkness, lit only by the bluish light of his phone. Outside, the suburbs slept, the neighbors' houses were drowning in silence, and the streetlights cast long shadows across the lawns. But inside Andrew, the storm did not subside. He saw her, Sarah, but not the one who cooked breakfast and walked the children to school, but the one who whispered, "I am your dirty fantasy," into the camera, the one who collected thousands of likes, the one who lived another life while he was at work. Like if betrayal is not about you. And in order not to miss the next story, be sure to subscribe. We appreciate each and every one of you. He didn't know how long he sat there, looking at the photo of her in the scarlet bodysuit, at the smile he hadn't seen in years. But when the first rays of dawn began to filter through the blinds, he realized he couldn't stay silent any longer. The truth he carried inside him was too heavy to keep inside. He heard Sarah wake up, the slight creak of her bed, the rustle of her footsteps in the bathroom, the sound of water running from the faucet. She came downstairs to the kitchen, where the coffee machine was already humming. Andrew clutched the phone, his heart pounding in his chest, and followed her. She stood at the stove, wearing her usual gray sweatshirt, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. The smell of coffee filled the kitchen, but even that couldn't mask the tension that had been in the air when Andrew walked in. She turned, her gaze flicking over his face, and for a second he thought she knew what was coming. "Andrew, have you been awake?" Her voice was soft, but there was a wariness in it, as if she was already preparing to defend herself. He didn't answer. Instead, he held up his phone, the screen still glowing with the @velvetmuse_X profile. The photo of Sarah in lacy lingerie stared at them both, like a third party to the conversation. Andrew turned the phone toward her, his hand shaking but his gaze steady. "It's you," he said, his voice low and hoarse and full of pain he could no longer contain. @velvetmuse_X. "It's you, Sarah." She froze, her eyes widening, but only for a moment. Then her face became impenetrable, like a mask. She didn't look away, but she didn't rush to justify herself. Instead, she crossed her arms over her chest and bowed her head slightly. So, her voice was calm, almost cold, but there was a tremor in it that she was trying to hide. "You were going through my phone." "I wasn't looking," Andrew snapped, anger rising in his throat. "You left it on the table and I saw a notification. And then, this." He nodded at the screen, where her photo was still glowing. "Thousands of subscribers, Sarah. Donations. Men write to you that they want you. Video with you. God, you're whispering that you're someone's fantasy. What the hell is this?" Sarah swallowed, her fingers curling around the hem of her sweatshirt. She was silent, but her eyes, the same eyes he'd seen in her stories, full of fire, were now empty, as if she'd hidden her entire life behind that mask. "Say something," Andrew almost shouted, his voice shaking. "Explain to me what the hell this is. Are you leading another life while I'm here, with the kids, with the job, with this house? Who the hell are you?" She finally looked up, and there was something sharp as a blade in her eyes. "I wanted to feel alive," she said, her voice quiet but each word cutting like a knife. "This is who I am. A woman who was tired of being just a mother and a wife. A woman who wanted to remember, just for a second, who she was." Andrew felt his heart tighten. Her words were true, but they were also a betrayal. He stepped closer, the phone still in his hand, the screen still glowing with her other life. "Alive?" he asked, his voice shaking with anger and pain. "What about me, Sarah? I'm not alive. I'm not a person. I'm your husband, damn it. I work, I try, I'm here with you, with the kids, every day. And you're whispering into the camera that you're someone's fantasy for thousands of people, but not for me." She looked at him, and her eyes finally filled with something not guilt, not fear, but a weariness so deep it seemed bottomless. "You stopped seeing me 3 years ago," she said, and her voice was like a blow, quiet but crushing. "You stopped noticing me, Andrew. I became furniture to you, part of the house, the mother of your children, but not a woman, not who I was." He opened his mouth to protest, but the words stuck. He wanted to scream that it wasn't true, that he had always seen her, always loved her, but the images from her profile, her smile, her gaze, her voice flashed in his memory. She was right, and it was killing him. He hadn't seen her like this in a long time. He hadn't noticed her like he hadn't noticed the creak of the parquet or the smell of coffee in the morning. She had become part of the routine, part of his life, but not the one that made his heart beat faster. 3 years? His voice was quieter, almost a whisper. "Do you really think that I just wrote you off?" Sarah shrugged, and the gesture was worse than any scream. "You didn't ask how I felt," she said. "You didn't ask what I wanted. You came home, ate dinner, looked at your phone, and went to bed. And I was suffocating, Andrew. This house, this life, it was like a cage. And I found a way to get out. If only for an hour, if only for a minute." "Get out?" He almost laughed, but the laugh was bitter, like poison. "Get out by filming yourself in lingerie for thousands of people, by accepting their money, by flirting with some guy in a cafe. This is your way of being alive." Her face tightened, but she didn't look away. "You don't understand," she said, her voice hardening. "This isn't about them. This is about me. I wanted to feel like I still existed, that I wasn't just a shadow in this house." "And me?" Andrew stepped closer, his voice rising to a scream. "What about me, Sarah? I'm suffocating too. I work until midnight, I try for us, for the kids, for this house. And you live another life where I don't even exist." She was silent, her lips trembling, but she wasn't crying. She just looked at him, and there was so much pain in her eyes that he felt guilty, even though she was the one who had shattered his world. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she finally said, her voice barely audible. "But I couldn't be invisible anymore." Andrew lowered his phone, the screen went blank, but the image of her in the video, her voice, her words was still there. "You could have talked to me," he said, his voice filled with desperation. "You could have told me you were sick. Why didn't you? Would you have heard me?" Her question was like a shot, precise and deadly. "Would you have stopped, looked at me, asked who I am, what I want, or would you have just nodded and moved on, as always?" He wanted to answer, wanted to say that yes, he would listen, he would change, he would fix it. But the truth was, he didn't know. He didn't know if he would notice her pain, if he would see her if she tried. He hung his head, feeling the anger give way to emptiness. "What now?" he asked, his voice almost pleading. "What do we do about this? About you? About this account? About us?" Sarah was silent for a long time, so long that the silence filled the kitchen again like a poisonous gas. "I don't know," she said finally, "but I can't pretend it didn't happen, and neither can you." Andrew looked at her, at the woman he loved but no longer knew. She stood before him in her gray sweatshirt, but he saw her differently, the one who lived on the screen, the one who was free, the one he had lost. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving his phone on the table, leaving her alone with this truth they now shared. Andrew stood by the living room window, looking out over the dark suburb, where the street lamps cast a cold light on the empty sidewalks. The silence in the house was not just the absence of sound, it was alive, thick as fog that enveloped and suffocated. After their morning conversation in the kitchen, after he had shown Sarah the screen of his phone with her profile on it, the world between them had cracked like glass, and now the shards lay everywhere, hurting them both. He had not returned to the kitchen, could not look at her, could not bear the look in her eyes, a mixture of guilt and defiance and weariness. Sarah had gone upstairs, and all day they had avoided each other, moving through the house like shadows, avoiding the sharp edges of the truth he had uncovered. The kids were at school, their absence making the house feel even emptier. Andrew tried to work, but the numbers and code on his laptop blurred into her face, the face he'd seen in her videos, her posts, her other life, where she wasn't his wife, but a star for thousands of strangers. Her words, "You stopped seeing me 3 years ago," played in his head like a broken record, and he couldn't turn them off. He felt betrayed, but also guilty, as if her secret was his failure, too. Towards evening, he heard her footsteps on the stairs. She came down, wearing the same gray sweatshirt that now seemed to him like a costume, hiding the real her. She stopped in the doorway of the living room, her arms crossed, as if she were protecting herself from something invisible. Andrew turned, his eyes met hers, and for a second he thought he saw the Sarah he had once known, young, in love, with sparks in her eyes. But it was only a moment. "We need to talk," she said, her voice quiet but firm, as if she had decided on something irreversible. Andrew nodded, though his insides twisted. He didn't want to have this conversation, but he knew that without it, they couldn't move forward, either together or apart. He gestured toward the couch, but remained standing, as if physical distance could protect him from what he was about to hear. Sarah sat up, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sleeve. She was silent, looking at the floor, and the silence between them was so heavy that Andrew could almost hear it humming. Finally, she looked up, and there was something new in her eyes, not defiance, not anger, but a kind of vulnerable honesty he hadn't seen in a long time. "It all started as a game," she began. Her voice was quiet, almost a whisper, as if she was afraid that the words would break something fragile. "I didn't plan any of this. Just one day, a couple of years ago, I was home. The kids were asleep. You were at work, and I felt empty, as if I didn't exist. I opened Instagram, created this account just to, I don't know, to feel like someone else. It was probably silly. A few photos, nothing special. I thought no one would notice." Andrew looked at her, his throat tightening. He wanted to interrupt, to ask how no one would notice when she now had 15,000 subscribers, but he remained silent, letting her speak. Then someone liked it, someone commented, and it was like a breath of air. She continued, her voice shaking but not stopping. I don't know how to explain it. Do you ever feel like you're disappearing? Like you're just part of the furniture, part of the routine? I was a mom, a wife, but I wasn't myself. And there, on that account, I could be anyone. I could be alive. Alive, Andrew repeated, his voice hoarse and pained. You say that as if me, the kids, this house, all we have is death. It's a prison. Sarah shook her head, her eyes shining, but she wasn't crying. No, Andrew, it's not like that. I love Mia, I love Lucas, I didn't mean for it to go this far. But every like, every comment, every donation, it was like proof that I still existed, that I wasn't just a shadow. And I got hooked. It became an addiction. Addiction, he almost laughed, but the laughter was bitter, like vinegar. You filmed yourself in your underwear, Sarah. You whispered into the camera that you were someone's fantasy. You took money from other men who wrote to you that they wanted you. That's not an addiction. That's cheating. She flinched, as if struck, but didn't look away. I didn't cheat on you, she said, her voice firmer, almost desperate. Not physically. This was all online. I never met these people, never crossed the line. It was fantasy, not reality. Andrew felt anger flare in his chest, like a fire he couldn't put out. Fantasy? He asked, his voice breaking. Are you serious? You think that justifies everything? You expect me to believe that this is all just on the internet? And that guy in the cafe? The one in your stories, in the reflections, with his hand next to yours? That's fantasy too. Sarah pressed her lips together, her fingers tightening on her sleeve. His name is David, she said quietly, and the name hit Andrew like a bullet. He's a photographer. He helped me with some of the shots. It's all professional, nothing more. Professional, Andrew stepped closer, his voice shaking with rage. You're sitting in a cafe with him, laughing like you're alive again, and I'm sitting at home like an idiot, thinking you're doing yoga? You call that professional? Sarah, I've seen your videos. You're whispering into the camera that you're someone's dirty fantasy. You expect me to believe that this is just a job. She stood up, her movement sharp, almost choppy, as if something inside had snapped, like a string that had been stretched too long. You don't understand. Her voice broke, grew louder, trembling with suppressed pain. There was so much truth in it, unfiltered, raw, that Andrew was momentarily silent. He couldn't remember the last time he'd heard her like this alive, not even and cold, not familiar and detached. I didn't want to lie to you, Andrew. I didn't want it to become so big. But I couldn't live like I was dead. I couldn't be just the one who cooked dinner and did the laundry anymore. I wanted to feel like I was still a woman, like I could still be wanted, like I could still be someone. He raised his head. Someone? His voice shook, but with anger. Almost a scream, almost a plea. His hands clenched into fists. He barely restrained himself from throwing them into the air. You are my wife, Sarah. You are the mother of our children. Isn't that enough? Didn't I try to make sure we had everything? I work until the night. I pay for this house, for the school, for everything. And you create another life where I am not, where I am nobody. Sarah didn't back down. Her eyes filled with tears, but she stood up straight, not letting them fall, as if crying meant giving in, and she didn't want to be weak anymore. You don't see me, she said, quietly, almost in a whisper, but in those words was everything. You haven't seen me for a long time. You look, but you don't see. You come home, and I'm just part of the background. I talk, and you nod your head, not listening. I sit across from you, and you're on your phone, in reports, tired. You don't ask me how I am, what I feel, what I'm afraid of, what I want. You just live next to me, and I couldn't take it anymore. I was slowly disappearing. She took a step back, hugging herself as if she was cold. This account, at @velvetmuse_X, is not about betrayal. It's about returning to yourself, to the part that hasn't died, to the woman who can still feel, desire, be brave. I wasn't looking for anyone. But when they looked at me, I realized that I hadn't felt alive for a long time. Her voice wavered, her gaze darted, and for a second there was a hint of guilt, yes, but stronger pain, accumulated over the years. Andrew stood there, silent, and for the first time in a long time, I heard her. Not just the words, but what's between them. What she's been trying to say for too long with gestures, silence, looks, lack of touch. Only now did he realize how long ago he had lost her, and how little he had done to bring her back. Andrew felt his anger crumble under the weight of her words. He wanted to scream, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he had always seen her, but the truth was, he didn't know. He couldn't remember the last time he had looked at her as anything other than a wife, or a mother, or a woman. He sank down onto the couch, his shoulders slumping as if all the air had been sucked out of him. "You could have told me," he said finally, his voice hoarse and desperate. "You could have just said you weren't feeling well. Why did you go there? Why not me?" Sarah looked at him, her eyes wet, but she held on. "I tried," she said. "Maybe not with words, but I tried. I tried to be bright, tried to be who I was when we first met. But you didn't notice. You were busy with work, with the kids, with life. And I don't blame you, Andrew. I really don't. But I couldn't wait any longer for you to see me again." He covered his face with his hands, feeling her words dig into him like needles. He wanted to hate her, he wanted to blame her, but the truth was, he saw his own fault. He saw the moments when she tried to speak, when she wore a dress instead of a sweatshirt, when she smiled at him, and he just nodded, lost in his thoughts. "So what now?" he asked, his voice barely audible, as if he didn't want to upset the delicate balance in the air. "You say you didn't cheat, but how can I trust you? How can I know this is all just online? How can I live with this account, these people, this David?" The words sounded not like an accusation, but a confession. He didn't shout, didn't throw rage in his face. He simply didn't know how to survive a betrayal that was not physical, but still tore him apart from the inside. Sarah was silent. Her fingers still tugged at the sleeve of her sweater, as if there, in the fabric, she might find support, an answer, forgiveness. There was guilt in her eyes, but more than that. Guilt was easy. What she had was something more complicated, a deep, awkward mix of regret, confusion, fear, and an honesty she could no longer hide. "I don't know," she said finally. "I don't know how to fix this. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to break up our family. I wanted to be me. I wanted to remember what it felt like to be me. There is. Not as a function, not as a mother, not as a wife, but as me, Sarah." Andrew looked at her, and in her eyes he saw not only pain, he saw himself. The same one that was also lost somewhere in fatigue, in bills, in the eternal, just a little more, and it will get easier. He saw how this woman in front of him was holding on with all her might, because she was afraid that if she broke, there would be nowhere for both of them to fall. He wanted to reach out, touch her fingers, her shoulder, her cheek, anything, just to remind her that he was there. But his hands were too heavy, as if filled with concrete, with restrained anger, pain, with what he had not spoken about for so long, afraid to admit even to himself. He wanted to say, "We can do this. If you want to, I want to too. If you stay, I'll stay. But we need to change everything." I wanted to, but I couldn't. The words got stuck, my throat tightened. And so he simply stood up, slowly, as if it was not willpower that was lifting him up, but inertia. He looked at her again in her eyes. There still lived a weak, almost extinguished, but real hope. He turned away. He took a step, stopped at the doorway. I expected that maybe she would say, "Don't go." But she remained silent. And he walked out of the living room, leaving her alone, not alone, Bhutan general silence, which now became their only truly honest space. There was no consolation in it, only the truth. Sarah remained seated, looking at the spot where he had just stood. Her lips twitched slightly. For the first time in the entire conversation, she thought that perhaps it really was over. Or perhaps it was just beginning, but not like before. Andrew woke up feeling like he hadn't slept at all. The bed next to him was empty. Sarah had left early, leaving a note in the kitchen. Going to drop the kids off, then meet them at school. Back for dinner. Her neat handwriting, which he had once found charming, now seemed like part of a mask that hid another woman, the one who lived in the @velvetnews_X profile. Their conversation the night before, her confession about how the game had become an addiction, how she was looking for a way to be alive, still echoed in his head. He didn't know if he believed her when she said she hadn't cheated physically, that it had been online. But even more, he didn't know how to live with that knowledge, how to look at her without seeing the one whispering into the camera, the words he wanted to hear himself. Andrew sat at the kitchen table, staring at his cold coffee. He wanted to hate her, but instead he felt empty and guilty. Her words about not seeing her for 3 years were like a splinter he couldn't pull out. He thought about how distant they had become, how their lives had become a series of routines. Work, kids, bills, silent dinners. He decided to try. Not to forgive, that was too soon, too painful, but to understand. To give her a chance to be honest, to create a space where she didn't hide behind secret accounts. But even that thought felt fragile, like glass ready to crack under the slightest pressure. The day dragged on. Andrew tried to work from home, but his thoughts kept returning to Sarah, to her words, to her other life. He opened his laptop, but instead of searching for reports, he typed in @velvetnews_X. The profile was still there, with her photo, with thousands of likes, with comments that made his heart clench. He closed the tab, feeling anger and curiosity warring inside him. He wanted to ask her if she was still posting, but he didn't know how to start the conversation without blowing up again. That evening, he and Sarah were due at a parent-teacher conference at Mia and Lucas's school. Andrew dressed mechanically, pulling on a button-down and jeans, and waited for her in the car. She emerged from the house, wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back into a low bun, her makeup barely there. She looked like the Sarah he knew, the mother, the wife, the woman from the suburbs. But now he saw her as someone else, the one who danced in the dim light, the one who collected donations, the one who was a dirty fantasy to thousands of strangers. They were silent in the car. The radio played a pop song softly, but even that couldn't fill the gap between them. Andrew stared at the road, his fingers gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than necessary. Sarah stared out the window, her hands in her lap, still, as if she were afraid to make an unnecessary movement. "Are you still publishing?" he finally asked, his voice low, almost neutral, but with a tense undertone. She turned to him, her eyes wary. "No," she said quietly, "not since you found out. I don't know what to do with this. Delete it. Keep it. I don't want this to come between us." Andrew nodded, but didn't answer. He wanted to believe her, but part of him, the part that had seen her stories, her smile in the cafe, her reflection with that man, David, couldn't. "I want you to be honest," he said, his eyes on the road. "Not just with me, but with yourself. If you need to, be who you were there, tell me. We'll figure it out. But don't lie." Sarah was silent, her fingers trembling slightly. "I'm trying," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "But it's not that easy. It's like a part of me. I don't know what to do without it." Her words hung in the air, and Andrew didn't know what to say. He felt like he was reaching across a chasm, but it was too wide, too deep. They arrived at the school, parked, and got out of the car, still not looking at each other. The parent-teacher conference was taking place in the auditorium, where other parents had already gathered, familiar faces, smiling, chatting about school projects and schedules. Andrew and Sarah sat in the back row, trying to look like a normal couple, but their silence was louder than any words. Mia's teacher, Mrs. Clark, started the meeting by talking about a new science project. Andrew tried to listen, but his mind was elsewhere. He stole glances at Sarah, who sat next to him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed ahead. She looked calm, but he knew it was a mask. He knew that underneath it was a woman who was searching for herself in her phone screen, in the likes, in the comments. During the break, the parents dispersed around the room, some going for coffee, some discussing school matters. Andrew stood up to pour himself some water, leaving Sarah at the table. He noticed a man standing by the wall about 30 years old, wearing a dark t-shirt and jeans, with a light stubble and a tattoo on his forearm. The man was looking at Sarah, and his gaze was not just curious, there was something predatory familiar. Andrew felt his stomach clench. The man approached their table, his gait confident, almost brazen. He stopped in front of Sarah, and Andrew stood by the cooler, watching. Sarah looked up, her face unreadable, but Andrew saw her fingers tighten on the edge of the table. "You're Sarah, right?" the man said, his voice low and slightly mocking. "At @velvetmuse_x, right? Damn, you're even hotter in person than in your pictures." Andrew felt the blood rush to his temples. He set the glass of water down on the table, his movements abrupt, almost uncontrollable. Sarah paled, her eyes widened, but she quickly pulled herself together. "You are wrong," she said. Her voice was cold but trembling. "I don't know what you are talking about." The man chuckled, his gaze sliding over her face, her body, as if he were seeing her not in a dress, but in the lacy bodysuit she'd posted. "Oh, come on, don't be modest," he said, leaning in a little closer. "I'm a fan. You're a hot mom, you know that. Those videos of you dancing, damn, they're fire." Andrew stepped forward, his fists clenched. "Fuck off," he said, his voice low, menacing. "You don't know what you're talking about." The man turned to him, his eyebrows raised, but he didn't back down. "Oh, who are you? The husband? You're lucky, brother, to have a wife like you." He looked back at Sarah, his smile sticky as cheap syrup. "How about a private one, like in your stories?" Sarah stood up, her movements jerky but controlled. "Go away," she said, her voice firm, but Andrew could see her hands shaking. "Now." The man raised his hands in surrender, but his smirk didn't disappear. Okay, no hard feelings. Just wanted to say you're a star." He winked and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of parents. Andrew watched him go, his heart pounding so hard he could barely hear the murmur of voices around him. He turned to Sarah, who was still standing, her face pale, her lips pressed together. "Do you know him?" he asked, his voice hoarse, full of anger and fear. She shook her head, her eyes avoiding his. "No," she said. "I've never seen him. He's just a follower, I guess." "Just a follower?" Andrew almost shouted, but stopped himself when he saw the other parents start to turn around. "He knows who you are, Sarah. He knows your account. He knows what you do, and he's here at our kids' school." Sarah swallowed, her fingers tightening on the hem of her dress. "I didn't ask him to come," she said, her voice quiet but panicked. "I didn't know it would happen. I didn't want this." Andrew looked at her, feeling the gap between them widen. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that this was an accident, that she wasn't lying, that her world in at @velvetmuse_x was only online. But the man, his words, his gaze, it was all too real, too close. "You didn't want it?" he asked, his voice full of bitterness. "You created this, Sarah. You made yourself this. And now it's coming here, into our lives, to our children." Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "I know," she said, her voice shaking. "I know it's my fault, but I don't know how to stop it. I don't know how to fix it." Andrew wanted to scream, wanted to grab her by the shoulders and shake her, to make her understand how deeply she had hurt him, their family, their lives. But instead, he just stood there, feeling his anger drown in exhaustion. "You have to decide," he said finally, his voice cold, almost alien. "Either you're with us or you're with this account, these people, but not both." Sarah looked at him, her eyes full of pain, but she said nothing. The meeting continued, they returned to their seats, but now there was more than just silence between them, there was a gap neither of them knew how to bridge. Andrew looked at the teacher, at the other parents, but all he saw was the man's face, his smirk, his words, "Hot mom." And he knew that this meeting was just the beginning, that the world of at @velvetmuse_x would no longer be a phone screen. Andrew sat in his home office, staring at his laptop screen, where the email from his boss still glowed like a toxic beacon. We regret to inform you that due to a company reorganization, your position will be eliminated. Your last day will be June 30th. The words were cold, formal, but they hit him like a hammer. 10 years at this company, sleepless nights, deadlines, missed Mia's school concerts, and Lucas's soccer games, all for the sake of stability, for their family, for this house in the suburbs with a neat lawn and a mortgage. And now it all came crashing down in an instant. He read the email over and over, hoping it was a mistake, but every word was like a nail being driven into his reality. It was getting dark outside. The suburbs were silent except for the distant bark of a dog. Sarah was home. He could hear her footsteps in the kitchen, the clatter of dishes, her muffled voice as she spoke on the phone. The kids were already asleep, their rooms upstairs were quiet, but the silence only made the storm in his head worse. He thought about Sarah, about her at velvetmuse_x profile, about how her secret life had burst into reality at a parent-teacher conference when a man who followed her had called her a hot mom. He thought about her confession, how she had said she was looking for a way to be alive, how she had insisted she had not cheated physically. But now, with this letter, with this emptiness that had opened up before him, it all seemed not just a betrayal, but a mockery. Andrew closed his laptop, his hands shaking. He felt anger, fear, and despair twisting into a tight knot in his chest. He'd lost his job, their stability, their future, all against the backdrop of her lies, her other life, her likes and donations. He stood up and walked into the kitchen, where Sarah was washing dishes. She was wearing her gray sweatshirt, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, but even in this mundane form, he saw her as someone else, the one who danced in a lace bodysuit, the one who whispered, "I'm your dirty fantasy," into the camera. The duality was tearing him apart. "I lost my job," he said, his voice low, almost dead, but with a storm in it, ready to break out. "Layoffs. I'm out of work in a month." Sarah froze, her hands hovering in the sink, soap suds dripping off her plate. She turned to him, her eyes wide, but there was no shock in them, only weariness, as if she were expecting another blow. How did this happen?" she asked, her voice cautious, as if she were treading on thin ice. "Reformation," he said, his tone sharp, almost accusatory. "They decided that I am unnecessary. 10 years, Sarah. 10 years I worked to make sure we had everything. And now we have nothing." She dried her hands on a towel, her movements slow, as if she were stalling for time. "We'll manage," she said finally, but her voice was weak, unconvincing. "You'll find another job. We'll figure something out." Andrew laughed, but it was bitter, like poison. "Can we do this?" he asked, his voice rising, shaking with anger. "Are you serious? Can we do this when I'm unemployed, with a mortgage, with 2 kids? And you, what are you doing, Sarah? Making your own videos for your subscribers? Taking donations from men who call you a hot mom? Is that your plan?" Her face tightened, her eyes narrowed. "Don't start," she said, her voice firm but pained. "I already explained it to you. It was a mistake, I know, but I'm not doing it anymore. I'm trying to make it right." "Fix it." He stepped closer, his voice rising to a scream. "You sold yourself out for likes, Sarah. You created this account where you're half naked, where you flirt with strangers, where you live another life, while I'm here, like an idiot, trying to keep our family afloat. And now, when everything's falling apart, you're telling me you're trying to fix it." Sarah recoiled as if struck, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "You have no right to say that," she said, her voice shaking but steely. "I wasn't selling myself. I was looking for a way to not go crazy, to not disappear, to not become a shadow in this house. Do you think it was easy? Do you think I wanted to lie?" "Lie?" Andrew nearly screamed, his fists clenched so hard his nails dug into his palms. "You didn't just lie, Sarah. You created a whole other life. You whispered into the camera that you were someone's fantasy. You accepted money from men who wanted you. And you expect me to believe that this was all just online, that photographer, David, was just shooting you for a portfolio. Do you think I'm blind?" She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears, but she wasn't crying. "I didn't cheat on you," she said, her voice quiet but full of desperation. "I told you it wasn't about them. It was about me, about how dead I felt until you even looked at me." Andrew felt her words cutting into him like knives. He wanted to brush them off, to tell her she was lying, that they were excuses, but part of him knew she was right. He didn't look at her not the way he had before, not the way she deserved. But now, with this letter, with this emptiness, he couldn't accept her truth. "And you betrayed me when you stopped wanting me," she said suddenly, and her voice was like a gunshot, sharp and precise. "You think it started with the account? No, Andrew. It started when you stopped seeing me as a woman. When you came home and looked right through me. When I tried to be with you and you turned away because you were too tired, too busy, too uncaring." He froze, her words like a blow to his chest. He wanted to protest, to say it wasn't true, that he'd always wanted her, but the memories, the smiles he'd ignored, the attempts he'd cut off, the dresses he'd ignored flashed through his mind. "You can't blame me for all this," he said, but his voice was weak, almost pleading. "I tried, Sarah. I worked, I kept us afloat. It's not my fault you decided to sell yourself online." Her face twisted in pain, and this time the tears did fall. "I wasn't selling myself," she said, her voice breaking. "I was looking for myself. I was looking for who I was before I was just a mother, just a wife, just a shadow. And you didn't even notice that I was disappearing." Andrew looked at her, feeling his anger crumble under the weight of her words. He wanted to scream, he wanted to blame, but the truth was, he could see his own fault. He could see the times she'd tried to reach out to him, when she'd been there, but he'd been too caught up in his own problems, in his work, in his life. "You could have told me," he said, his voice rough and tired. "You could have just said you weren't feeling well. Why did you go there? Why not me?" Sarah shook her head, tears falling onto the counter. "I tried," she said. "Maybe not with words, but I tried. I wore your favorite shirt. I cooked your favorite meals. I waited for you in the evenings. But you were somewhere else, and I couldn't wait any longer for you to come back to me." He closed his eyes, feeling her words tear him apart. He wanted to hate her, wanted to blame her for everything, the account, the likes, the man at the meeting, the gap between them. But he couldn't, because he'd seen how they'd both gotten to this point step by step, silence by silence, look by look. "So what now?" he asked. His voice was barely audible, as if he was no longer speaking to her, but to himself. "I'm out of work. You're with this account, with these people who know you more than I do, who come into our lives like a shadow. What do we do? How do we live on?" He didn't look up at her. The words sounded like an admission of defeat, not a cry, not a reproach request, at least about some point of reference from which to push off, like a drowning man clinging to any splinter just so as not to sink to the bottom. Sarah was silent. Her fingers were still clutching the edge of the tabletop tightly, as if it was the only thing she could hold on to keep herself from falling apart. There was no anger in her face, only an endless weariness. The weariness of someone who had lost herself and now didn't know how to get back. "I don't know," she said finally. Her voice was dull, but there was truth in it, unvarnished by excuses. "But I don't want us to lose everything. I don't want everything we've built to disappear like this. I want us to try. If only for Mia and Lucas. If only for them." She fell silent and added, almost in a whisper, "And maybe for us, if there is still a we." Andrew looked up. He was looking at her, the woman he had once loved without looking back, the woman he had shared laughter, bed, dreams with. Now she was in front of him, still familiar, but unfamiliar, as if someone had drawn her anew with the same lines, but in a different color. There was pain in her face, sincerity, and an almost invisible but stubborn hope. He wanted to answer, to say that yes, they would try, that he still wanted her back, wanted to be there for her, not for the children, but for them. But the words didn't come. Only bitterness, only fatigue. He looked past her, as if through her, and suddenly felt how deep the gap was that had grown between them. It wasn't sudden. It had been building up over the years from unsaid conversations, from delayed touches, from not having time for each other. It wasn't a breakup, it was erased. And he didn't know if he had the strength to start over, or if she did. He turned slowly. He took a few steps. Sarah didn't stop him. She just stood there, clutching the tabletop like an anchor in a storm. He walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone. Not because he didn't want to stay, but because he didn't know how. Silence filled the house again. But now it was not just the absence of sound, it had become their shared fate, as you said. But even fate is not a sentence. It is simply a road that must either be passed or broken. Andrew sat in his office, which no longer felt like a refuge, but a cage, hiding from the wreckage of their lives. Outside, the suburbs were dark with autumn, the streetlights casting a dim light on the rain-slicked sidewalks. The silence in the house wasn't just emptiness, it was saturated with their decisions, their silent agreements, their attempts not to ruin everything completely. After he'd lost his job, after their shouting matches in the kitchen, where he'd accused Sarah of selling herself out for likes, and she'd told him he'd betrayed her with indifference, they'd both realized that things couldn't go on like this. The gap between them wasn't just a crack, it was bottomless, and neither of them knew how to bridge it. The decision to separate did not come in the heat of an argument, not in shouting or tears, not with slamming doors and broken cups, but in cold, almost businesslike silence. It wasn't a disaster, but concession to reality, as an acknowledgement of a diagnosis that had long been ignored until the pain became chronic. It happened a few days ago at dinner. Mia and Lucas were already asleep, some pretending, some really asleep. The TV in the living room was still humming softly, but the dining room was as quiet as a library before closing. They sat across from each other. Sarah ran her finger along the edge of her linen napkin, over and over, like a spiral. Andrew stared at his plate of half-eaten pasta, but he couldn't taste it. They didn't look at each other. Not because they were angry, because they were scared. Because they knew that if they met each other's eyes, everything would happen before they were ready. Sarah spoke first. Her voice was even almost matter-of-fact, as if she were ordering a new dishwasher. "We can't live like this," she said, and those simple words sent a chill down Andrew's spine. "It's destroying us, and the children." She spoke calmly, but every word was filled with fatigue, not from quarrels, but from invisible war, which had gone on for too long. She had carried that phrase inside her for months. He knew that now. He saw it in the hunched shoulders, in the way she stopped laughing, even with the children, in the way she no longer sang to herself as she chopped vegetables. Andrew nodded, not arguing, not contradicting, because there was nothing to argue with. Everything that could be said had already been said or ignored. He knew she was right, and yet it still felt like a blow. The house that was once their shared dream has now become an arena not for heated arguments, but for something worse. Silent defeature, the walls were not witnesses to love. They became soundproofing for two parallel lives existing in the same space. He tried to say something, maybe there's still something we can do, or let's wait, but the words wouldn't come. Because he didn't believe in maybe anymore. They had waited too long for things to get easier, and instead of light at the end of the tunnel, there was a crack that only grew. "I can go to my sister's. For now. For a couple of weeks," Sarah said quietly. "So the kids get used to it. Gradually." He nodded again, his insides clenching, but he only pressed his lips together, not allowing himself to flinch. "Will you tell them?" she asked. "No, we are together. Tomorrow, no details," he squeezed out. Sarah nodded, stood up, and began clearing away the dishes as if everything had gone according to plan. Dinner, conversation, decision, washing. And he remained sitting, looking into the cold paste. And he thought, when exactly did we stop being we? And why is it that silence now speaks louder than any words? They agreed to separate. Andrew would rent a flat nearby so he could be close to the kids. Mia and Lucas would split the time, living with him 1 week, with Sarah the next. They discussed the details as if it were a contract. who would pick up the kids from school on Wednesdays, how they would split the expenses, how they would explain to Mia and Lucas that their family would be different now. Andrew was surprised by how easily they talked about it, as if divorce were just another item on a to-do list. But inside, he felt something dying, not the love, but the hope that they could make things right. Sarah stayed in the house while Andrew looked for an apartment. He found a small two-room apartment 10 minutes away, with bare walls and creaky hardwood floors. The move was quick, a few boxes of clothes, books, his laptop. He took nothing that reminded him of their life together. No photos, no souvenirs from their trips, not the vase Sarah had bought at a flea market during their first year of marriage. He wanted to start over, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, not the one in the gray sweatshirt, but the one who lived in at @velvetmuse_x, the one who danced in the dim light, the one he had lost. The kids took the news better than he expected. Mia, her eyes serious, asked, "Will you still love us?" Andrew hugged her, feeling his throat tighten. "Always," he said, and that was the only truth he knew for sure. Lucas was quieter, but his questions were sharp. "Why can't you just make up?" Andrew didn't know what to say. He mumbled something about adults sometimes not being able to live together, but the words sounded hollow, as if he were reading from a script. The first week without kids was like entering a vacuum for Andrew. His apartment was too quiet, too empty. He tried to fill the time, looking for a job, sending out a resume, going to interviews, but the market was ruthless. His experience, his 10 years at the company, his skills, none of it seemed needed. He would go home, pour himself a whiskey, and sit in the dark, staring at the walls that still smelled of fresh paint. In those moments, he would think about Sarah, about what she was doing, about whether she had deleted at @velvetmuse_x as she had promised, or whether she still lived in a world where he was superfluous. One evening, while scrolling through Instagram, a habit he couldn't break, he came across a new account. It was Sarah, but not at @velvetmuse_x. The new profile was called @SarenFiltered, and the avatar was of her not in a lacy bodysuit, not in the dark, but in a plain t-shirt, her hair disheveled, sitting on their old couch. The bio read, "Mom, woman, human," writing about motherhood, sex, depression, and everything that makes us real. Andrew paused, his fingers hovering over the screen. He wasn't sure if he was feeling angry, curious, relieved, or hurt. But he clicked. Her first post was long, almost confessional. It wasn't theatrical, not meant for effect. It was written the way people write in the dark, when no one is looking. Sarah wrote about motherhood as both a blessing and a cage. She didn't blame, she didn't complain, she just confessed. "Being a mother means being everything to someone, but losing yourself," she wrote. "I love my children until it hurts. But sometimes the pain is not from love, but from the fact that you yourself are no longer there. You are hands, food, a smile. And where am I? I looked for myself in the mirror, in clothes, in words that no one heard, even when I spoke." Andrew read, feeling his heart slowly squeeze. In every word, he recognized her, not at @velvetmuse_x, not the woman in the racy photos and suggestive comments, but that very Sarah, with whom he once spoke at night until the sun rose. He did not see a traitor in these lines. He saw a woman lost at the bottom of her own life. And it was no less painful. The next post was about sex, explicit, but not at all what he expected. Not about the body, but about the shadow that had fallen over him. "I stopped feeling desired," she wrote, "not because I wasn't loved, but because I stopped seeing myself as a woman. Desire isn't about looks. It's about someone seeing you and saying you are. I looked for this feeling everywhere, in other people's eyes, in random words, in likes. It was a mistake, but it was mine, and it made me alive, at least for a while." Andrew swallowed, his fingers shaking. He wanted to close the app. He wanted to forget, to erase, not to see, not to know. But he couldn't. Each word was a blow, but also a revelation. He couldn't stop reading, like someone who can't look away from a wound that had been hidden all this time, under clothes, under the years, under everyday conversations. He realized she was screaming. For a long time, I just didn't do it out loud. He scrolled further, short notes, phrases, photographs. Not provocations, not challenges, but a question. Do you see me now? And for the first time in a long time, he didn't know the answer. He felt that between them there was no betrayal, but pain that he himself did not understand. He was tired too, yes. He was lost too. But Sarah found a way out, albeit strange, albeit dangerous, albeit alien, and he simply disappeared next to her. He closed his eyes, and he whispered, almost out of habit, "Oh my God, how did we get to this point?" But there was no answer. Only silence, not empty, but complete. Those words that he didn't hear then. She wrote about depression not as a diagnosis, but as a shadow that followed her. "There are days when I don't want to get up," she confessed. "When I look at my kids and feel guilty because I can't be the mom they deserve. But I got up, because I have to." Andrew felt tears sting his eyes. He'd never known she felt this. He'd seen her weariness, her silence, but he'd never asked what was behind it. He'd thought she was coping, that she was strong, that she would always be the Sarah he'd met 10 years ago. He scrolled on, post after post. She wrote about how she'd tried to be the perfect wife, but lost herself in the effort. About how her account, she wouldn't name it, but Andrew knew what it was had become both her salvation and her trap. "I wanted to be seen," she wrote, "but I didn't know it would cost me everything." She wrote about their divorce, not blaming him, not making excuses, just stating the fact. "We loved each other," one line read, "but sometimes love doesn't mean you can be together." Andrew closed his phone, breathing hard as if he'd run a marathon. For the first time, he realized that he'd never really known her. He knew Sarah the wife, Sarah the mom, Sarah the one who cooked dinner and left notes on the refrigerator. But he didn't know Sarah, who struggled with depression, who searched for herself in the mirror, who felt invisible. He didn't know the woman who wrote these words, honest, vulnerable, alive. The next day, he picked up the kids for his week. Mia chatted about school. Lucas showed off the new comic he'd bought. Andrew smiled, joked, but his thoughts were with Sarah. He thought about her blog, about how she'd opened up to the world, how she'd stopped hiding. He thought about how he wanted to talk to her, not to accuse, not to argue, just to listen. But he didn't know how to start. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, he opened at Sarah and filtered again. The new post was about forgiveness. "I forgive myself for the mistakes I've made," she wrote, "and I'm learning to forgive those who haven't seen me, because we're all just people trying to live." Andrew felt his throat tighten. He wanted to text her, to tell her that he was reading, that he saw, that he understood. But instead, he simply liked the post, a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but to him, it was enormous. He went to bed, but he couldn't sleep. He thought about Sarah, about her new life, about how she had found a way to be honest, not just with the world, but with herself. He thought about how their love, their family, their dreams had become something else, but they weren't gone. They were still connected by their children, by their memories, by this pain they now shared. And for the first time in a long time, Andrew felt not anger, not guilt, but something like hope, weak, fragile, but alive. Andrew stood in his new apartment, the bare walls still brimming with his presence. The light from the single lamp in the living room fell across the worn hardwood floors, casting long shadows like the ghosts of his past life. The boxes of things he had brought from their house were still piled in the corner, unpacked, as if he feared that unpacking would make this move permanent. Outside, the suburbs were alive with their nightlife. Street lights flickering, cars rushing along the highway, and a dog barking in the distance, reminding him that the world was still moving, even as his own stood still. It was late, almost midnight, and the silence in the apartment was more than just an absence of sound. It was palpable, like cold air that cut into his bones. The last few weeks had been a blur. The job search that hadn't yielded results yet, talking to Mia and Lucas, alternating between staying at his and Sarah's, trying to keep their world from collapsing even as he was already in ruins. The no-frills divorce, as they called it, had been less a release than a burden. He and Sarah had tried to be civil, texting about the kids' schedules, school pickups, who would buy Lucas new sneakers. But every time her name popped up on his phone, Andrew felt a pang, not anger, not pain, but something more complicated, something he couldn't name. He went into the bathroom, the only place in the apartment where he could look at himself without distraction. The mirror above the sink was old, with darkened edges, and the reflection in it seemed alien to him. The man with tired eyes, with grayer hair than he remembered, looked at him like a stranger. "Who are you now?" he asked himself, but his voice was barely audible, drowned out by the sound of water pouring from the faucet. He was no longer the Andrew who had made plans for a future with Sarah, who had worked until midnight to pay for their house, who had thought he knew his wife. But he didn't feel like a new man. Either he was somewhere in the middle, suspended, like a ship that had lost its anchor. Andrew thought about Sarah, not the one who stayed in their house, but the one who now lived on her new blog at Sarah Filtered. He'd started reading it soon after they'd decided to split up, first out of curiosity, then out of some inexplicable need. Her posts were like windows into a soul he'd never really seen. She wrote about motherhood, how it had simultaneously made and broken her, about sex, which had become more than an act for her, but a search for herself, about depression, which came uninvited and left scarred. Each post was like a letter she'd never sent him, but which he now read, his heart aching at her honesty. Her last post, which he read today, was about home, not the walls and the roof, but what makes a place home. "I was a stranger in my own home," she wrote, "not because I was unloved, but because I had lost myself. I looked for myself in the mirror, in my clothes, in words no one heard, and I'm still looking. But now I do it openly, without masks." Andrew reread the lines several times, feeling them dig into him like needles. He saw her in those words, not the star from at Velvet Muse _X, not the wife who cooked dinner, but the woman who was fighting to stay alive. He walked back into the living room, sat down on the couch, which creaked under his weight, and picked up his phone. His fingers hovered over the screen, as if he were about to do something forbidden. He knew he shouldn't, but he opened Instagram anyway. His old account, which he barely used, now felt like a part of the life he'd left behind. He looked at his profile picture, a photo of Mia and Lucas on the beach 2 years ago, when they were still a family. It was too painful, too fake. He couldn't be the same person who posted family photos, pretending everything was okay. Andrew clicked the button to create a new account. He thought long and hard about the name, going through options that seemed either too cheesy or too pretentious. Finally, he settled on at Andrew Unraveled Simple, but honest. In his bio, he wrote, "A father, a man searching for himself, trying to figure out who I am now." It was the first thing he'd written about himself in a long time, and it felt like an exhale, like he was finally letting himself breathe. He uploaded a profile picture not of his face, but of a sunset he'd taken last week while walking with Lucas in the park. The orange and pink streaks of sky above the dark trees felt like more than just a landscape. They were a promise that even after the darkest night, there was light. He didn't know if he'd post anything, but creating an account was a step, a small one, but a meaningful one. It was his way of telling the world and himself that he was still here, that he was still alive. Andrew opened the search engine and typed in at Sarah Filtered. Her profile appeared instantly, with the same profile picture of her sitting on their old couch, her hair wild and her eyes wide. He scrolled through her posts, rereading the ones he already knew, and lingered on the last one about home, about how she was an outsider. He clicked the follow button, and a notification flashed across the screen, as if he'd just signed an invisible contract. His finger hovered over the like button beneath her post. It was a simple action, a single click, but to him it was more an acknowledgement that he saw her, that he heard her, that he was perhaps beginning to understand. He clicked like. The little heart glowed red, and Andrew felt something shift inside him. It wasn't forgiveness, not really. It wasn't a return to what they'd lost. But it was a beginning, fragile and uncertain, like the first shoots after a long winter. He set his phone down on the table, the screen still glowing with her post, and went back into the bathroom. He looked into the mirror again, but now the reflection didn't seem so alien. The man with the tired eyes was still there, but there was something new in his gaze, not confidence, not strength, but a spark, faint but alive. "Who am I now?" he asked again, but this time the question wasn't desperate. It was a challenge, an invitation to find out who he could become. Andrew turned off the light and lay down on the couch, not making it into a bed. He stared at the ceiling, listening to the silence that wasn't so heavy now. He thought about Sarah, about her blog, about her words, about how she had found a way to be honest. He thought about Mia and Lucas, about their laughter, about their questions, about their future. And he thought about himself, not who he was, but who he could be. For the first time in a long time, he fell asleep without whiskey, without anger, with a sense that tomorrow might not be like yesterday. Each story is a step towards understanding yourself and the world. If this story left a mark on your soul, don't forget to support it with a like and a comment. Subscribe, because it only gets stronger, deeper, and more interesting. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.